Hello, this is part 2 of our training series entitled Solving B to the R Today. In part 1, we began exploring being able to identify legal and illegal back row attacks. But how do we do that? Well, we found that if we were first able to identify who our back row players are during the dead ball prior to beckoning for serve and contact for service, that we would probably more accurately be able to rule on legal back row attacks, illegal back row attacks, legal and illegal blocks. In part 2 of this series, we're going to continue what we started in part 1 by way of using a collegiate match to look at every rotation and being able to identify the back row players for each team. As we did in part 1, we're going to break down what rotation each of our teams in. We're going to look for our setters, look for our liberos, hopefully identify their opposites, and we're going to attempt to use all this information that we learned to put the puzzle together and identify our back row players for both teams in each and every rally. Again, we have gone over rotations and other training presentations, but let's do a quick review. A rotation is a team's numerical representation of the setter's location and position. Remember, rotations 1, 2, and 3, our setter will always be back row. In rotations 4, 5, and 6, our setter is always front row. On this particular slide, we feature a table of the setter's position, the team's rotation, and the setter's status. In this particular training presentation, we're going to look at common alignments that you will see a lot of volleyball teams in, especially in serve receive. We're going to show you alignments from all 6 rotations. In this particular match from the University of Kentucky versus the University of Louisville. In this particular match, Kentucky is running a 5-1 offense, which means our setter, number 4, will play in all 6 rotations and all 6 positions. In this particular match, the University of Louisville is running a 6-2 offense. In this particular version of the 6-2, our setters number 5 and 8 will mostly only play in the back row, rotations 1, 2, and 3. You may find teams that run a 6-2, and in that particular version of the 6-2, they may have one of their setters play rotations 1, 2, and 3 and play only in the back row, and a setter will come in and play only the front row in rotations 4, 5, and 6. We have gone over opposites and other training presentations, but let's do a quick review. So opposites are players of volleyball players who do not and will not ever play in the same row in a set. In this particular example, we have our starting lineup of players 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. We notice that our right back and our left front are opposites. For our Team Walker serving, that would be players 1 and 4. And of course, our right back would be our server. The middle back and middle front are opposites. And where Team Walker is serving, this would be players 3 and 6. And the left back and right front are opposites. And where Team Walker is serving in this example, that would be players 2 and 5. We're going to use opposites as information to help us be able to identify back row players for each team in this presentation. This is basically a brief table of our setter, the setter's position, the team's rotation, the status of our setter, the opposite of our setter, the opposite position number of our opposite and opposite status. I will tell you up top that if you are able to identify your setter and their opposite in each and every rally, you are halfway home to being able to identify back row players in each and every rally. So, in order to solve the puzzle that is identifying your back row players, here are some tips and tricks and patterns. Setter and opposite. Find them. Know them for both teams each and every rally. One of them has to be a back row player depending on the team's rotation. If the libero is in, happy day. Find a libero in the opposite. And you know that the libero has got to be a back row player, so you can eliminate the libero's opposite from being a back row player because the opposite of the libero has to be a front row player. And if you are paying attention, which we should be, then you know that the server or person who has just served has to be a back row player. Here's some patterns that will probably happen for not all teams, but almost 90% of teams will probably follow some of these patterns. For our serving team, more times than not, most serving teams will line up their front row players in the front zone prior to beckoning for serve and prior to service contact. That should be extremely helpful for the next tip. Said serving team, more times than not, probably 90% of teams will have their back row players who are not serving in the back zone, which means that if said serving team has their back row players lined up in the back zone prior to service contact, you should be able to identify all the back row players for the serving team because you know one of them has to be the server. And more times than not, most receiving teams for almost all rotations will try to have their setter somewhere in the front zone. There will be some particular alignments in rotation 1 where this may not be applicable. If you are a math fan or a geometry fan, which most of you probably are not, but you can also use geometry to help you with solving the puzzle. A lot of times, teams will line up each corresponding front row and each corresponding back row in the following shapes. Sometimes they will line them up in the V or U shape, and that V and U may be forwards or it may be backwards. Sometimes receiving teams will have each corresponding row lined up in the curved arc. That actually may be very helpful for you, for those of you who like to remember things that way when trying to identify your front row players and your back row players. In rotation 1, we know that our setter for Louisville is right back. Now we're talking about Louisville in serve receive. So we know that our setter for Louisville is a back row, obviously. Now the libero for Louisville is also in our match for this particular rally. So since our libero is in and we have a back row setter, we know 2 of our 3 back row players. So we've almost solved the puzzle on Louisville's side of the net for this particular rally. So we know 2 of our back row players for Louisville in this particular rally where Louisville's in serve receive. Our back row setter, circled in yellow, and our libero, who is next to our back row setter. Here's a pattern. Usually, when the libero is next to the back row setter in rotation 1 in serve receive, usually we'll have our left back right next to the libero on the left. We have circled the remaining back row player in blue. So guess what? We have saw our back row players for Louisville in serve receive rotation 1 prior to contact for serve. Now, in this rotation 1 where Louisville is serve receive, Kentucky is serving. And Kentucky is in rotation 1 as well, which means that our back row setter for Kentucky has to be serving. Of course, this makes her the right back. Our libero for Kentucky is in, and she is the middle back. Following usual patterns we've talked about, our front row players for Kentucky are in the front zone, and our back row players for Kentucky, not named the server, are in the back zone. And we can see that our left back for Kentucky is to the left and behind the libero. So guess what? When and if Kentucky loses the serve, we should know all our back row players for Kentucky, because Kentucky is serving. When they go to serve receiving rotation 1, we will have the same 3 back row players as we described. So when Kentucky is in serve receive rotation 1, we would hope that from our prior slide when they were serving that we should know who our back row players are. But if for some reason we have a moment where we go blank, we can figure them out again. In rotation 1, we know that our setter for Kentucky, who we have circled in yellow, is right back. Remember, our setter was just our prior server. The libero was in for Kentucky, so we know we have 2 of our 3 back row players, our libero and our back row server. If we were paying attention when Kentucky was serving in rotation 1, we should know our 3 back row players. But if for some reason we lost track of one of them, here's how we can regain the knowledge of our 3 back row players. We know that our setter was just our prior server for Kentucky, so obviously Kentucky's in rotation 1. If we have knowledge of opposites, we know that the player right behind number 1 is the opposite of the libero. So obviously that player would have to be the front row player. And if we paid attention while Kentucky was serving, then we know that the player circled in blue is the other back row player in this particular rally. So see how observation, paying attention to the server, knowing our rotations, and knowing patterns can help us identify our back row players in each and every rally prior to contact for service. Now we see that Louisville, who's serving in this particular rally, is in rotation 2. This means that our setter has to be our middle back. Our libero is still in the contest, so our libero has to be our left back. And of course, our server has to be right back. So we know our 3 back row players for Louisville in this rally. If they lose the serve in this rally prior to the end of the set, we should hopefully be able to maintain who our back row players are. Now Louisville is in serve receive. We know our setter for Louisville in yellow has to be the middle back in rotation 2. We also know that our libero for Louisville has to be back row. So we know 2 of our 3 back row players. Thus, we've almost solved the puzzle on Louisville's side of the net for this rally with regards to who our back row players are. Again, just for review, we know that our setter is middle back in rotation 2. Obviously, she must be one of our back row players. We know that the libero always has to be a back row player. So now we know 2 of our back row players in this particular rally. We should know that the player in blue more than likely may have been our previous server. And so she is the remaining back row player in this particular rally. Kentucky is serving in this particular rally, and they are also in rotation 2. Our setter for Kentucky is middle back in rotation 2. Our libero, who is in the game for Kentucky, is our left back. And of course, our server has to be our right back. And they fit in the pattern that teams often do when they're serving. I've had all their back row players that are not the server in the back zone and all the front row players in the front zone. So obviously, we should know prior to service contact who our back row players are for Kentucky for not only this rally and for rallies when they lose the serve and are in rotation 2 serve receive. Speaking of rotation 2 serve receive from Kentucky, we know that our setter has to be the middle back, circled in yellow. We know that our libero has to be the left back, and of course, is a back row player by rule. So guess what? If we did not remember from when Kentucky was serving, when we're putting this puzzle back together, we already know 2 of our 3 back row players for Kentucky. Again, so our setter is middle back in rotation 2. She's the first back row player. We know the libero for Kentucky has to be our other back row player. But again, if we paid attention, then we know that the player circled in blue was the previous server and has to be the remaining back row player in this rally for Kentucky. Now, Kentucky is in rotation 2 for serve receive. Louisville is in rotation 3. So we know that the setter for Louisville in rotation 3 has to be the left back. She is one of our back row players. Our libero is our server, so obviously she has to be the other back row player. And we know the player circled in blue for Louisville was the prior server for Louisville. So we know our 3 back row players for Louisville as they are in rotation 3. And when and if they lose to serve, they will be the same 3 back row players for rotation 3 serve receive. Speaking of serve receive, for Louisville, we know our setter is our left back. Hopefully, we are always keeping up with our setters after each and every rally. That is the key to putting this puzzle together. Our setter is left back. Obviously, she has to be a back row player. Our libero has just served for Louisville, so we know, obviously, she has to be a back row player. So we've almost solved the puzzle of our back row players on Louisville's side of the net. Again, we know our setter in rotation 3 has to be the left back. We're keeping up with our setter for each and every rally. Our libero, who was the previous server, is our right back. While Louisville was serving, we recall that the player circled in blue is the middle back. Thus, we know our 3 back row players for Louisville in serve receive. Louisville is currently in rotation 3 serve receive. Kentucky, who is serving, is also in rotation 3, which means that our setter, circled in red, is our left back. Our libero is serving and has to be right back, so we already know 2 of our back row players. So Kentucky seems to be in the pattern of having all of their back row players in the back zone prior to service contact when serving. This is one of the patterns that we talked about that 90% of teams will probably use, having their back row players in the back zone not named the server prior to service contact when serving, and their front row players in the front zone prior to service contact when serving. So the remaining back row player for Kentucky must be the player that is circled in blue. So serve receive for Kentucky in rotation 3, we should know who our 3 back row players are if we were paying attention when they were serving. But just in case we lost track, let's put the pieces of the puzzle back together. Our setter, who we should always know, is left back in rotation 3, circled in yellow. Our libero, who was just our previous server, always has to be a back row player. So we know two of our three back row players for Kentucky in this particular rally. Again, in rotation 3, serve receive for Kentucky. Our back row setter, who is the left back, is circled in yellow. Our previous server was the libero, who was the right back player. So we know two of our three back row players. We recall that when Kentucky was serving, that the player circled in blue is the middle back. Thus, we know all three of our back row players. In this version of the 6-2, Louisville has substituted such that the current server is the other setter. So our setter, who is our server, has to be a right back. The Louisville libero was just the previous server. Thus, she is the middle back. And because we're observing patterns where Louisville has all their front row players in the front zone and the back row players not named server in the back zone prior to server's contact when they're serving, this would leave the player circled in blue as the remaining back row player, and she happens to be our left back. In rotation 4 for Kentucky, serve receive, we know that our setter, circled in yellow, is our left front. Our libero obviously has to be a back row player. Just from these two pieces of information alone, without including opposites, we only know one of our three back row players. So we would have a little bit more work to do to solve the puzzle on Kentucky's side of the net for identifying our back row players in this particular rally. Now, we add the information from our lesson opposites. We know that our setter, who is our left front, her opposite should be the right back, circled in blue. And if you don't see the circle in blue, our right back is in that coffin corner on the right side of the screen near the Kentucky bench. The Kentucky libero was the prior server. Thus, she is our middle back. So we know two of our three back row players for Kentucky. Our knowledge of alignments would tell you that teams often stack the front row players to one side in rotation 4. And if we do process elimination, that would make the player circled in orange our left back. Rotation 5 for Kentucky serve receive. The thing that rotations 4, 5, and 6 have in common, just off the bat, is that we know our setters are always going to be front row. And if our liberos are in during rotations 4, 5, and 6, without knowledge of opposites or alignments, we're only going to know one of our back row players off the top. And that's the case here. We know in rotation 5, our setter for Kentucky is the middle front, circled in yellow. We know our libero obviously has to be a back row player. So again, without the knowledge of opposites and alignments, we need to do a little bit more work to solve the puzzle on Kentucky's side of the net of identifying our back row players. But again, if we include opposites now, and we have been paying attention to the setter and the opposite, the middle front's opposite is the middle back, circled in blue. Hopefully we've been doing a good job throughout the match of keeping up with our setters and their opposites. We know our libero is a back row player, so now we know two of our three back row players for Kentucky. Our knowledge of alignments in rotation 5 would have us deduce that the player circled in orange is the right back. And if we were being observant for when Kentucky was serving in rotation 5, more than likely our player circled in orange and being the right back probably was the previous server. Again, similar to rotations 4 and 5, rotation 6 sees us with a front row setter. In this case, our setter for Kentucky, circled in yellow, is our right front. Since our libero is in for Kentucky, we know we at least have one of our three back row players. And without including opposites and alignments as of yet, we have a little bit more work to do to solve the puzzle of our remaining back row players for Kentucky. But because we have been doing our due diligence after each and every rally of keeping up with our setters and opposites, we know that our setter's opposite is the left back that we have circled in blue. We know that our libero is our right back. So our knowledge of alignments would have us deduce that the player circled in orange is our middle back. So now we know our 3 back row players for Kentucky. Thank you for viewing and taking part in our training series, Solving B to the R today. We hope this particular training series gave you some excellent clarity, insight, wisdom, tips, and tricks for accurately being able to identify back row players, such that now you can accurately rule on legal and illegal back row attacks and legal and illegal blocks. Thank you once again for spending part of your day with us. Have a great day, a great week, a great month, a great year, a great season.